Have you often wondered why human life on earth is such a mixture and a puzzle? Certainly, any reasonable observer who has lived on this planet for any length of time will probably have noticed that the life of man is a mixed bag indeed. Yes, human life is a mixture of laughter and tears, a mixture of light and darkness, a mixture of hope and despair, a mixture of joy and sadness, and a mixture of delight and despondency. The question that remains on the lips of many is, why should this be so? Despite the fact that God is good, God is loving, God is just, and God is the overall boss, the Almighty. For example, all around us, we witness the births of babies when new lives begin. Also, we see people grow old and die. This was why an amazed and saddened psalmist wrote in Psalm 90 verse 6, "In the morning it flourishes and springs up. In the evening it is mown down and withers." Again, we all admire the beauty of nature. For instance, we stand and wonder when the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows and proclaims his handiwork. In the same breath, we often see convulsions in nature when the center cannot hold. Earth tremors, storms, and tsunamis often challenge our imaginations. Often, we see peaceful periods in various human societies around the world, just as we witness conflicts of various dimensions. For instance, who can forget the Industrial Revolution, which marked an advancement in manufacturing processes? Surprisingly also, there were world wars where millions of people died. It is no wonder then that human existence on earth is often described as harmony in chaos. A close look at occurrences from the very beginning certainly provides some clues that will address our bewilderment. Take note that the very first verse of the first book of the Bible talks about creation. This verse dwells on order and on the glory of creation. The verse actually reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Every Bible reader will probably remember that God is all light and there is no darkness in him. Not only this, we must also key into the fact that whatever God does is good. Whatever God does is perfect. Whatever God does is seemly. And whatever God does is generally reflective of his nature. This first verse of the Bible surely proclaims the glory of God's work. However, looking at verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, immediately alerts us to the fact that something serious happened between verses 1 and 2 of Genesis chapter 1. This verse 2 reads as follows, and I would like you to take note, especially. I read, "The earth was without form and an empty waste, and darkness was upon the face of the very great deep. The Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters." This verse talks about formlessness, void, and darkness. We all know that God has nothing to do with any of these three things. That is, formlessness, void, and darkness. Considering that scriptures interpret scriptures, we know that certain seismic or major events took place between Genesis 1 verse 1 and Genesis 1 verse 2. Believe it or not, the events described in Isaiah 14 verses 12 to 14 and Revelation chapter 12 verses 7 to 9 actually took place between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. The angels who rebelled against God and started the war in heaven were therefore the ones responsible for changing the status quo in creation. Opposition to and rebellion against God automatically translated into darkness, disorder, and disintegration. Sadly, every part of creation was affected by this, especially the earth. Hence, the narrative in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. This was how darkness came into the creation. Therefore, what began to take place in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 was actually recreation. This was after the devastation caused in verse 2. We must take note that creation had already taken place in Genesis 1 verse 1. And considering what took place between verses 1 and 2, which was detailed in Isaiah 14 and Revelation 12, darkness had now become a reality in creation. Darkness had now come into existence in creation. This darkness was personified by Satan and his rebellious angelic forces. It was also an indication that physical darkness had its origin in the spirit realm. When therefore the Almighty began to recreate in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3, the first thing he did was to bring about light. You will notice that this light was different from the lights of the sun and the moon, which were created in verse 16 of Genesis chapter 1. In verse 4, what God did was to separate light from darkness. You will probably notice that God did not remove or annihilate darkness. He only separated the darkness from the light. Thus light existed side by side with darkness. Then the idea to create man started to take shape in the mind of God in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26. Interestingly, even though man was created last, he became the doyen of earthly creation. He was flawless, having been created in the image, that is, the very image of the Almighty. And he was to be in charge of all earthly creation. This had been the plan of God from eternity past. However, before man could truly enter into his destiny and take effective and full charge of earthly creation, he needed to be tried and tested. Unfortunately, when man was tested, he failed woefully. The first human couple blew it. The failure of man simply meant that he had made an opening for darkness to invade his earthly existence. He had welcomed the influence of Satan and his fallen angels in his life. There was, however, no doubt that God did not abandon man after his fall. What it meant was that after the fall of man, light and darkness will now compete to have ascendancy and supremacy in the life of man. Of course, this simply meant that whichever one he allows will rule over his life. This was how human life became a mixture of light and darkness, a mixture of sweet and sour, a mixture of good and evil, a mixture of life and death, a mixture of lack and abundance. The big question is, which one do humans allow to invade their lives? Between light and darkness, between good and evil, between sweet and sour. And do they really have a choice? We shall look at this in part 2 of this series. Thank you.